Hey gals and guys, welcome back to another weekly episode of Cursage Gaming. This time, we're going to be doing a Pokemon creepypasta for the very first time called Pokemon Diablo version. Without any further delay, let's dive into Pokemon Diablo version. So the story begins like how any other story does, with the player saying how a robber robbed him or her of a couple of three things. His or her Nintendo Game Boy Color, Nintendo DS, and a bunch of other shit. The story flashes back to when the player was a 6-year-old child visiting his or her grandparents for the very first time on his or her 6th birthday. The player's granddaddy gave him or her a Sega Game Boy Color with Pokemon Red version as a birthday present for his or her 6th birthday. The label was slightly torn off, which should have turned the player off, but didn't because both the game and the Game Boy were fairly old, according to the player. Flash forward about 30 hours, 8 minutes, 87 seconds, and 104 milliseconds later. The player would return to his or her parents' home located at 308 Negra Arroyo Lane, Albuquerque, New Mexico 87104. The player's father gave him or her a Sony Game Boy Advance SP and Pokemon Ruby, after the player's father gave him or her the Microsoft trademarked Game Boy Advance SP and Pokemon Ruby. The player's father said to him or her that he's gonna go grocery shopping for some milk, and left the player's residence, which may or may not be evil, by the way. The player's father never returned since. The player didn't care that his or her father abandoned him or her, and was just excited to play some Pokemon on his or her brand new Atari Game Boy Advance SP. Since the fatherless player had a massive erection, he or she completely forgot about the gift his or her grandpappy gave him or her. The story then proceeds to have a time jump similar to the 6-year time jump in Better Call Saul Season 6 Episode 9 titled Fun and Games. Speaking of fun and games, the fatherless player then tells us, the reader, how much fun he or she had with his or her games. The games in question being, of course, the Pokemon games, of course. The fatherless player owned every single Pokemon game ever made, including Puzzle Challenge or Pinball, which were absolute doo-doo sauce, according to the player. The fatherless player's life was going surprisingly well until... Diablo. No, I'm not talking about Diablo 4, okay? We don't talk about that. One day, back in the 20th of January in 2008, the fatherless player was scrummaging around in his or her attic, attempting to find his or her old Nintendo Genesis to play some Mario the Hedgehog 2. Instead, the fatherless player found a dusty box with his or her grandpapa's Magnavox Game Boy Color and Pokemon Color Red, as well as some pieces of paper that were ripped apart. The fatherless player took about 4 steps to be precise to examine the papers. It turns out the papers were from the government. The fatherless player didn't really care, and was just excited to play some more Pokemon. The fatherless player found his or her grand male parents' Pokemon Color Red, which had its label torn off. The fatherless player put that aside, thinking it looked like that due to it probably more than likely perhaps a pre-owned copy. The fatherless player proceeded to insert his or her long and wide thick copy of Pokemon Ruby Red into his or her Activision Game Boy Color and booted up the game. Upon bootman billing up the game, the fatherless player found out that the game indeed was probably more than likely perhaps pre-owned. The original owner had around 665 hours and 59 seconds of game time, which was some real David Copperfield shit, according to the fatherless player. It turns out the original player's character was named Angel, and assumed that it had to be the name of the original owner. This is when things started to get weird, according to the daddyless player. The daddyless player spawned in a room called Inferno. The Inferno room was filled to the ass cheeks with lava and a bunch of other shit that contained red and black colors. The daddyless player decided to check his or her party of Pokemans, which consisted of Magmar, Jynx, Electabuzz, Moltres, Jynx, Dragonite, and Jynx, who are all level 55, as well as a level 100 Charizard. Each Pokemon had its own name. Magmar and Electabuzz were both named 6, Jynx was named 5, Moltres was named Colon, Jynx was named 5, Dragonite didn't even have a fucking name, Jynx was named 5, and Charizard was named 59. The daddyless player took 5 seconds to instantly realize that the names of the Pokemans were approximately the exact same as the original owner's playtime of this game, which was 665 hours and 59 seconds, in case you gals and guys didn't remember. The daddyless player peeked in his or her pants after realizing this, and shrugged it off and proceeded with the Let's Play. The daddyless player reached some ladders, which appeared to be made out of human bones. The daddyless player ignored this and proceeded to reverse Snake Eater downwards on the ladders. The further down the Populous Gamer went, the darker the screen got. Down as in the 4th episode of the 2nd season of Breaking Bad titled Down. Eventually, the Populous Gamer heard a loud crack noise, and the screen cut to black, for probably 63.53 seconds to be exact. Eventually, the lights came back on, and the Populous Gamer's character was upside down and lacked any visible eyes. The Populous Gamer tried to move his or her character, but couldn't. It's just that the game wouldn't allow him or her to do so. In front of the male parentless gamer, okay, this joke is fucking stupid now, there was a broken ladder in front of the player. The player assumed the ladder breaking is what the loud crack noise was. The player's character started moving slowly on its own, and eventually stopped due to a strange noise being heard. It sounded like Mewtwo and Ghastly having an orgy, which startled the player. Then a text box appeared. ... ¿Por qué veniste aquí, demonio blanco? Not to be confused with Walter Blanco, the protagonist of the record-breaking series not by Vince Gilligan called Metastases, of course. The player whipped out his or her Nokia, and used Google Translate to translate the possibly Hispanic words. The possibly Hispanic words translated to, "Why... ... White Devil came here." The player turned into a grammar Nazi, and said that it should have translated to, ... Why did you come here, White Devil? The player thought this was quite strange, because he or she never remembered this being in the original game. Then some fucking weird thing popped up and tried to jump the player. He or she tried moving his or her character, but just couldn't, and watched in horror as his or her character got the Howard Hamlin treatment spoiler alert. But right before he or she got discombobulated, the screen cut to black. The screen then turned back on, and suddenly the player was transported to Pallet Town. Only that there was 2 roads on each side. The player also noticed that the music was the Cerulean Cave music, only reversed. The player was absolutely gobsmacked by this, and just decided to make a bad choice and go down the road. It's almost as if you can call this road Bad Choice Road. Bad Choice Road, as in the 9th episode of the 5th season of Better Call Saul titled Bad Choice Road. The player was transported to Johto, and tried to go down another Bad Choice Road, but couldn't due to that fucking weird thing that almost ASAC Schradered the player, blocking the path. That fucking weird thing that almost Andrea Cantillo'd all over the player was facing in the opposite direction, so the player was safe for now. The player went the other way towards another Bad Choice Road, and was transported to Violet City. But the strange thing was that the Sprout Tower wasn't even finished, like it was basically still under construction. It basically looked like the final battle of Spider-Man 3. There wasn't even a Pokemon Center. This is the moment when the player realized this was a ROM hack. the player decided to come up with his or her own headcanon. The player educationally guessed that this ROM took place in the past around 2002, which means that Nadja Varga has yet to commit Chuck McGill, spoiler alert. The player thought, "Damn, that's a long ass time ago, my boy." After the player was done theorizing about a game, he or she used his or her level 55 Dragon Knight to fly the fuck out of that shit. The player had 3 options: Violet City, Pallet Town, and Ukritek City. The player decided to fly to Liberty City, Ukritek City, because he or she did not go there yet. Upon choosing Vice City, the player was approached by that fucking weird thing that almost Lalo Salamanca'd the player, sprinting towards him or her. The player barely escaped that thing just in the Nicolas Cage of time by spanking his or her Dragon Knight to go faster. Upon arriving in Ukritek City, the player noticed that the music was the normal Ukritek City theme, only that it was in reverse. The player was completely unfazed by this because the music was just not scary. If the music was made by Dave Porter, then the player definitely would have RE3-maked his or her trousers. The player decided to make his or her way downtown, walking fast, faces past, and his earthbound abortion theory towards the burnt tower. Apparently the tower wasn't destroyed like in Gisk. Instead, it was built different, and there was a sign near the building which read, "Majestic Tower, a place to worship the giver of life." The player was quite upset, as this was lore breaking, since the Arceus lore didn't exist until After the player was done having a fanboy rage due to the lore of this ROM breaking bad, the player was then thrust into a face-off. Face-off as in the season finale of the 4th season of Breaking Bad titled Face-Off. Anyways, the player was abruptly thrown into a Breaking Bad Season 4 Episode 13 with that fucking weird thing that almost Gus Fringed all over the player. The music was the final battle theme from Gisk, only that it was in reverse, which was cliched, according to the player. As the fight started, a text box showed up saying, "Si muero, todos los demás también muere. ... The player was too slow to put this into Google Translate, due to it only appearing on screen for about 1.4483369 seconds to be absolutely exact. But not to worry, gals and guys, I can translate it for you since I cheated my way through my Spanish classes. The text translates to, "If I die, everyone else dies too. ... The fucking weird thing that almost gobbled the player's ghoul had 3 Pokemans in captivity, the 3 Pokemans in question being Cubone, Nidoran, and a Rattata. The fucking weird thing that almost broke the player's bad used its spooky demon powers to Chuck McGill the player, which in turn also burnt the other 3 Pokemans alive. The screen then flashed white, which turned the player on, because apparently the Game Boy couldn't produce such amazing cinematography. According to the player, the player's character then suddenly turned into Ho-Oh and revived the 3 dead Pokemans into the 3 legendary dogs, Suicune, Entei, and Raikou. The player absolutely nutted in his or her El Camino, a Breaking Bad movie underoos, at the realization that he or she was witnessing this historic event unfolding before his or her very eyes. The 3 legendary doggos then ran away into the sunset. Sunset as in the 6th episode of the 3rd season of Breaking Bad titled Sunset. The camera then panned leftwards towards the Ho-Oh, flying off into the great beyond as the townsfolk watched in awe and wonder and ecstasy and horniness and astonishment. The screen then slowly faded to black, with the executive producer Vince Gilligan Peter Gould credit showing up and fading away too. The game then booted the player back to the title, which allowed the player to soak in what he or she just witnessed. The player proceeded to pull down his or her pants and started calling his or her soul for the better. After slipping his or her Jimmy, The player checked the game time and was absolutely fegelmeistered by the fact that the game time was 666. And the player's character's name was Diablo. So that was our very first Pokemon creepypasta we have ever done. And for the very first Pokemon creepypasta we have ever done, I'd have to say this was pretty choice, yo. But it does come with its own bag of issues, unfortunately. Where it all falls flat is its lack of references to The Sopranos. There was a really big missed opportunity for one of the 3 things that were robbed by the player to be Pokemon cards, which were hard-edged, according to Christopher Moltisanti. It would explain how Christopher got the Pokemon cards in the first place. Huge plot hole there by both the writer of this story and the writer of The Sopranos. Unbravo, David. And no, David Chase, I'm not unbravoing you for the many saints of Newark. Even though that movie's a steaming pile of fly-infested fecal matter, I'm unbravoing you for this one singular plot hole. Another issue I have with this story is that it has quite a large amount of cliches. The whole reversed music and player not being able to move and the player telling us how big of a fan he or she is of the Pokemon games did slightly un-AM my C+. But even still, those cliches didn't really exactly take me out of the whole experience, so I can give the story a pass. Also, what was with the player's male parent having letters from the government? Like, was the player's dad an agent for the FIB? Was he working for the feds? That could explain why the player's father vanished. Tony Soprano probably whacked him for being a rat. Hopefully the author could explain that in the sequel, or if he or she ever plans on writing one. Now where the story excels is in its creep factor. The author did a magnificent job in making the reader feel scared whenever that fucking weird thing that almost Todd Alquisted the player appeared on screen. The part where it started sprinting towards the player actually made me peek in my underwear signed by Bryan Cranston FR for real. Also, that fucking weird thing that almost Werner Zieglered the player didn't have that many appearances, so it didn't exactly overstay its welcome, and that's something I applaud the author for. That fucking weird thing that almost Gail Bedecker the player is easily one of the best creepypasta antagonists ever. And I hope the author makes a sequel with it returning. Hell, maybe even a prequel explaining its origins, specifically the original BO2 version. One other thing I thought was nice was the revelation that this game was actually a prequel, and that this game took place right before the 3 legendary doggos were born. The scene where the player's character turned into Ho-Oh made me durr all over my Reese. So not only is this a good story, but it's also a good prequel. Easily up there with Better Call Saul as great sequels. Now let's talk about its realism. This could actually be real. I can totally see someone making a ROM, explaining the lore of Pokemon, and giving it to the player. I can actually confirm this because my dad actually works at Game Freak, and I asked him if this was real, and he said, "Yes." So there's that. So, this was a pretty decent creepypasta despite its cliches and glaring plot holes. I'd highly recommend you gals and guys read it, especially if you're a Pokemon fan. So what would you gals and guys rate it? Comment down below. This has been another episode of Cursage Gaming, and if you like what you saw, make sure you like, comment, and pokey all over that subscribe buttons, man. Dislike it if you dislike it. This is me, Skeledevil, and I'm out.